The rain hammered the city like angry fists, and Evelyn Carter tightened her worn jacket around her trembling body. She stood on the sidewalk, staring at the locked doors of the diner that had just fired her. No severance pay, no apology, just a cold dismissal into the storm. Her last paycheck barely covered a week's groceries, and now the future stretched before her like a void. Her fingers gripped the fabric of her jacket so hard they ached. Headlights blurred through the downpour, casting fleeting shadows across the street. Evelyn wiped the water from her eyes just in time to see a man sprinting toward her, a bundle of papers flying from his messenger bag. He wasn't looking, and neither was she, until the collision sent them both sprawling onto the soaked pavement. For a split second, the world was just rain and cold and confusion. Then pain. "I'm so sorry," the man gasped, scrambling to help her up. His voice was raw with panic, but there was something else in his eyes, a wild desperation Evelyn recognized all too well. She winced, pulling herself upright, brushing the muddy water from her jeans. "It's fine," she said, though it clearly wasn't. Her hip throbbed. Her pride throbbed harder. The man, dripping wet and breathless, looked even worse off. His shirt clung to his frame, soaked through, and his face was pale under the streetlights. "I didn't see you," he said again, voice cracking. Evelyn noticed the torn strap of his bag, the tattered papers spilling out. Contracts, maybe. Something official, something that clearly didn't belong to someone so lost. "I'll survive," she muttered, scooping up a few of the papers and handing them back. The words on the pages blurred, something about mergers, acquisitions, too formal for someone who looked like he'd just lost everything. "Are you okay?" she asked against her better judgment. He blinked at her as if the question surprised him. "No," he said honestly, and a bitter laugh escaped his lips, "but thanks for asking." A bus roared by, sending another wave of dirty water over the curb. Evelyn shivered. She should walk away. She should protect herself. But something in the man's expression, a kind of brokenness she knew intimately, made her hesitate. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she asked. The man looked away, shoving the soaked papers back into his ruined bag. "Not anymore," he said, voice low. I walked out, left it all behind." "Left what behind?" she pressed, sensing a story but not wanting to pry too much. He just shook his head. Rain dripped from his hair down the side of his face, mixing with whatever frustration he was barely holding back. "Everything," he whispered. They stood there in the rain, two strangers suspended between broken pasts and uncertain futures. Evelyn's hands itched from the cold, but it wasn't just that. It was the memory of nights she had spent alone, abandoned, wishing someone, anyone, would have noticed. "There's a shelter," she said finally, nodding down the street. "Not far." "You could dry off there, get warm." The man hesitated. Pride flickered in his tired eyes. "I don't have," he began, but Evelyn cut him off with a small, weary smile. "Neither do I," she said, "but they don't ask questions." He stared at her, something softening. "Thank you," he said, voice hoarse. "I'm Daniel, by the way. Daniel Reed." "Evelyn," she replied. For a moment they just stood there. The rain, the ruined papers, the wreckage of whatever life he'd left behind. It was all so absurd that Evelyn let out a short, breathless laugh. Daniel smiled weakly, a real smile this time, and for the first time that night the darkness seemed a little less heavy. "Come on," she said, leading the way. Neither of them knew it yet, but that night, the night everything fell apart, was also the night everything began. The shelter smelled of wet clothes and old coffee, but to Evelyn it was a sanctuary. She led Daniel through the creaky doors, nodding at the night manager, who barely glanced up from his crossword puzzle. A few tired souls, huddled in the corners, wrapped in donated blankets, lost in their own storms. It wasn't paradise, but it was dry and warm, two luxuries Evelyn had learned never to take for granted. Daniel hesitated in the doorway like a man teetering on the edge of something bigger than himself. Evelyn nudged him gently. "It's not the Ritz, but it's better than pneumonia," she said, flashing a half-smile. Daniel managed a soft chuckle, the sound as brittle as glass. He followed her to an empty bench, his soaked shoes squeaking against the cracked linoleum floor. "You sure you don't want to stay too?" he asked, lowering his voice. His question caught her off guard. She shook her head. "I'm good," she lied, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. Her mind flashed to her empty apartment 2 blocks away, the eviction notice fluttering on the door like a taunt. She wouldn't tell him that, though. She wouldn't tell anyone. Daniel watched her for a moment longer than necessary, as if he could sense the lie, but chose not to call it out. Instead, he dropped onto the bench, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. Evelyn turned to leave, the weight of the night pulling her down like an anchor, but Daniel's voice stopped her. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to." Evelyn hesitated, her hand on the rusted door handle. She glanced back at him. The ruined papers, the ruined man. "Yeah," she said softly. "I kinda did." She pushed through the door into the night. The rain had lightened to a mist, softening the city's edges into blurred lights and shadowy outlines. Evelyn tugged her jacket closer, shivering not just from the cold, but from the gnawing fear that she had just complicated her life even more. She didn't need another broken person depending on her. She could barely hold herself together. Her steps echoed down the empty street, each one heavier than the last. As she rounded a corner, she spotted an old payphone tucked into a graffiti-covered alcove. On impulse, she stepped inside, lifting the receiver even though she had no quarters. She just needed to hear a dial tone, to pretend for a second that someone was on the other end who cared. Static filled her ear. Of course. She hung up and leaned her forehead against the glass, letting herself be small for just a moment. Then, with a sigh, she straightened and kept walking. Her apartment wasn't far, just far enough to feel like a different universe. By the time she pushed open the cracked door to her studio, she was soaked to the bone again. Inside, the space was even colder than outside. Her landlord had cut the heating last week. Evelyn peeled off her jacket, draping it over the single chair, and sat on the bare mattress. The eviction notice fluttered against the doorframe, mocking her. She ripped it down without reading it and crumpled it in her fist. Tomorrow, she promised herself. Tomorrow she would figure something out. The hours dragged by in a haze of exhaustion and worry. Every creak of the building made her jump. Every gust of wind rattling the windows sounded like a warning. Somewhere deep in the night, she found herself thinking about Daniel, about the lost look in his eyes, about the way he hadn't pretended to be okay. There was something brutally honest about him, something she both admired and feared. In a different life, she thought, maybe they could have been friends, maybe more. She pulled an old notebook from under the mattress, her secret habit. Inside, dozens of paper cranes were folded neatly between the pages, each one a silent wish. A wish for hope, for courage, for a better ending than the one life seemed determined to give her. Carefully, she folded a new crane, her fingers working through the motions by muscle memory. On the wing, she scrawled a message in shaky handwriting. Even broken wings can fly. The next morning, Evelyn rose before the sun, her body aching, but her mind stubbornly awake. She tucked the newest crane into her jacket pocket before stepping out into the damp streets. The city smelled like wet concrete and stale dreams, but Evelyn held her chin high. She refused to be one more person the world forgot. At the corner bakery, she used her last few dollars to buy a day-old pastry and a coffee so bitter it made her eyes water. She didn't care. She needed fuel. She needed something in her hands, something warm. As she sat on a splintered bench, Outside, she caught sight of a familiar figure walking down the street, head bowed against the cold. Daniel. He hadn't seen her yet. His bag was still torn, his shoes still soaked through, but there was a strange determination in his stride. Now, a man clinging to some invisible thread. Evelyn felt a pang of something she didn't want to name. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just loneliness looking for company. Either way, she stood up and waved. Daniel noticed her only after he had nearly passed by, his eyes lifting just enough to catch the wave of her hand. For a moment, hesitation flickered across his face, as if he were unsure whether he should stop or keep going. Then, almost reluctantly, he changed direction and walked toward her. Evelyn offered a small smile, hoping to bridge the awkwardness between them. "Hey," she said simply, holding out the paper bag with the half-eaten pastry. "You look like you could use this more than I can." Daniel blinked, surprised, but took the bag without protest. He slid onto the bench beside her, the dampness of his clothes seeping into the air between them. The city bustled on around them, oblivious to the silent battle being fought in small, desperate gestures. "Thanks," Daniel said after a beat. He took a careful bite, chewing slowly like he wasn't used to accepting kindness from strangers. Evelyn sipped her coffee, letting the bitter liquid anchor her. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The world seemed to shrink down to their little corner, two souls adrift in a sea of moving parts. "You didn't have to do this," Daniel said eventually, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much since they parted. "It weighs last night." Evelyn shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Maybe I didn't. Maybe I just didn't want to be the kind of person who walks past someone who's drowning." Daniel looked at her then, really looked. And Evelyn had the odd sensation that he saw more than she was comfortable revealing. His gaze wasn't invasive, it was searching, like he was trying to decide whether he could trust her. She wondered if he saw the cracks she tried so hard to hide, the hunger, the fear, the stubborn flicker of hope. "Where are you headed?" she asked, needing to break the tension before it unraveled her completely. Daniel hesitated. "Nowhere," he said finally. "Everywhere." It wasn't a real answer, but Evelyn understood. Sometimes running felt safer than standing still. "You got a plan?" she asked, half joking. Daniel smiled faintly, a ghost of humor crossing his features. "Find a dry place. Figure out the rest later." "Solid," she said, nodding. "Really strategic." Daniel laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. For a second, the world didn't seem so heavy. Evelyn tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear and watched him finish the pastry in a few hungry bites. She thought about asking more. Who he really was, why he looked like a man who had been to war and back, but she knew better than to push. Everyone carried their own ghosts. "You know," Daniel said, brushing crumbs from his lap, "most people wouldn't have stopped. Most people wouldn't have even looked twice." "Yeah, well," Evelyn said, staring at the cracked pavement. "Most. People suck." Daniel barked a sharp laugh, then sobered quickly. "You don't," he said. His voice was almost too soft to hear. Evelyn felt heat rush to her cheeks and hated how easily his words slipped under her skin. She stood up abruptly, stuffing her coffee cup into the trash. "You'll be okay?" she asked, her tone brisker than she intended. Daniel looked up at her, rainwater dripping from his hair. "I'll manage," he said. "Thanks to you." Evelyn hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect herself and the growing, dangerous need to not walk away. In the end, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the tiny paper crane she had folded last night. Without a word, she set it on the bench beside him. Daniel picked it up carefully, frowning slightly at the message scrawled on its wing. "Even broken wings can fly." When he looked up, Evelyn was already disappearing into the crowd. The paper crane sat in Daniel's palm like a fragile secret. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the delicate folds. Something stirred deep inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. It was reckless, irrational, dangerous, but it was there. He tucked the crane carefully into the pocket of his jacket and stood. The city loomed before him, vast and uncaring. But for the first time in days, maybe weeks, Daniel Reed didn't feel completely alone. And somewhere, deep in the marrow of his bones, he made a decision. He would find her again. He would find a way to deserve her kindness, no matter what it cost. The city wore a different face in the morning light, softer somehow, almost forgiving. Evelyn moved through the streets like a ghost, her mind stuck, replaying every glance, every word she had exchanged with Daniel. She kept telling herself she had done enough. She didn't owe him anything. Yet her steps, almost unconsciously, drifted back toward the shelter where she had left him. When she arrived, the place was already emptying out. People shuffled past her with downcast eyes, carrying plastic bags filled with the remnants of their lives. She scanned the faces but didn't see Daniel. A strange pang of disappointment stabbed through her, sharper than she expected. She told herself it didn't matter. It wasn't her problem. It couldn't be. Still, she stepped inside, the stale warmth closing around her like a blanket. The night manager glanced up, recognition flickering across his face. "You looking for someone?" he asked, tapping his pen against his crossword. Evelyn hesitated, embarrassed by the hope she couldn't quite hide. "Tall guy, dark hair, looks like he's been dragged through a hurricane." The man snorted. "That describes half my guests." But then he tilted his head thoughtfully. "Someone matching that came in last night. Didn't stay long, though. Left just before dawn." He scribbled something on his paper, then added, "Left this behind." He handed her a small piece of paper, crumpled, damp, and nearly torn in half. Evelyn smoothed it carefully, her heart skipping as she read the hastily scrawled words. "Thank you for seeing me. No name, no contact, just those few simple, devastating words." Evelyn folded the note neatly and tucked it into her jacket next to the paper crane. She should have let it go, should have walked out, found a job, fixed her own messes. Instead, she found herself wandering the city, eyes scanning every crowd, for a glimpse of him. She didn't find Daniel that day, or the next. Days blurred together in a wash of grey skies and endless rejection emails. Her landlord banged on her door, demanding rent she didn't have. Evelyn responded by locking the door and pretending she wasn't home. She was good at pretending. It wasn't until 3 days later that she saw him again. She was passing a tiny bookstore crammed between 2 towering office buildings when she caught a glimpse of a familiar figure through the window. Daniel sat hunched over a battered table, an open book in front of him, a cup of coffee cooling at his elbow. His clothes were still damp-looking, but cleaner. His hair was combed back loosely. He looked different, lighter, more alive. Evelyn hesitated, unsure whether to intrude. Before she could decide, Daniel glanced up, and their eyes locked. Recognition flashed between them like a spark. Slowly, carefully, he stood and made his way to the door, pushing it open so the little brass bell above it jingled. "I was starting to think I imagined you," he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're not that lucky." Evelyn shot back, crossing her arms to hide how fast her heart was racing. Daniel laughed, a sound that seemed to genuinely surprise him. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to join him inside. Against her better judgment, Evelyn did. The bookstore smelled like old paper and dreams, a combination she found strangely comforting. They settled back at the small table, the city noise fading to a distant hum beyond the windows. Daniel tapped his fingers lightly on the closed book. "Did you know," he said almost conversationally, "that in some cultures a paper crane is a symbol of hope?" Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "Did you Google that after I left?" Daniel chuckled. "Maybe. Or maybe I just wanted to understand why. A girl would hand a complete stranger something so fragile and then disappear into the night. Evelyn shrugged, but her chest tightened. Maybe I just had a few too many cranes lying around. Daniel studied her like he didn't quite believe her, like he knew there was more under the surface. She didn't like being seen that clearly. It made her feel naked, vulnerable, but with Daniel it didn't feel dangerous, it felt safe. "You saved me that night," Daniel said, voice low. "You don't even know how much." Evelyn shook her head. "I didn't save you. I just gave you a dry place to sit." Daniel smiled sadly. "Sometimes that's all it takes." The moment stretched between them, taut with something unspoken. Evelyn wanted to ask about his past, about why he looked like a man running from something bigger than just a bad night, but she bit her tongue. Daniel Reed was a puzzle she wasn't ready to solve. Not yet. Instead, she reached into her jacket and pulled out another paper crane, this one folded from a page torn from an old book. She set it gently on the table between them. No words this time, just a silent offering. Daniel picked it up reverently, as if she had handed him a priceless artifact. He didn't unfold it, he just held it, his thumb brushing over the delicate wings. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn didn't feel so alone. But somewhere deep inside, in the part of her that never stopped scanning for danger, a whisper stirred. "He's not telling you everything." Evelyn returned to the bookstore the next day, telling herself it was for the free Wi-Fi. She needed to look for jobs, after all, practical, responsible reasons. But when she pushed open the heavy glass door and heard the familiar jingle of the bell, her eyes immediately searched for Daniel. He was there, tucked into the same corner table, a new pile of books beside him like armor. He looked up as if he had been waiting for her. Evelyn hated how good that made her feel. She hesitated at the threshold, the cold air clinging to her jacket. "Don't you have anywhere else to haunt?" she teased lightly, crossing the room. Daniel's smile was small but real. "Not anymore," he said. "Besides, it's quieter here. Fewer ghosts." Evelyn slid into the seat across from him, noting the dark circles under his eyes. She wondered if he had slept at all, or if he had spent the night, battling whatever demons had chased him here. She didn't ask. She knew better than most that some battles couldn't be shared, not yet. "Find anything good?" she asked, nodding toward the stack of books. Daniel picked up the top one, a battered volume on small business management, and set it down again. "Thinking about new beginnings," he said. His voice was casual, but there was an edge to it, like a blade honed too thin. "Maybe it's time." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "New beginnings require plans and money." Daniel's mouth twitched. "One step at a time." They fell into an easy silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of pages or the hiss of the coffee machine behind the counter. Evelyn pulled out her battered laptop, tapping idly at the keys. She wasn't really working. She was just glad to have somewhere to exist, without being questioned, without feeling judged. "Tell me something," Daniel said suddenly, leaning forward, elbows on the table. "If you could do anything, anything at all, what would it be?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years. Dreams had become a luxury she couldn't afford. Still, the answer rose to her lips before she could stop it. "Open a cafe," she said, almost whispering. "Somewhere small, cozy, full of books and art and hope." Daniel's eyes lit up, like he was memorizing every word. "Sounds like exactly the kind of place this city needs." Evelyn laughed, a soft, bitter sound. "This city chews up dreams like that and spits them out." "Then you open it anyway," Daniel said, voice fierce in a way that made her look at him differently. "You build something so stubborn, so full of light, that the city has no choice but to let it stay." Evelyn stared at him, heart pounding. Who was this man, sitting in a crumbling bookstore, talking about defying the world like it was possible? What had he lost that made him cling so desperately to hope? Before she could ask, Daniel shifted, pulling a worn leather notebook from his jacket. He flipped it open, revealing pages of sketches, not of people, but of spaces, coffee shops, libraries, parks, dreams given form in shaky pencil lines. "You draw?" she asked, amazed. Daniel shrugged, almost shy. "I design, buildings mostly. Used to." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. Evelyn leaned closer, studying the intricate designs. There was something haunting about them. Beautiful, but unfinished, like promises that had been broken before they could be kept. "You're really good," she said sincerely. Daniel smiled, but there was a sadness in it that she didn't understand. Yet, "Thanks," he said, "but good doesn't always matter." Before Evelyn could respond, the door jingled open, and a gust of cold air swept into the store. A man in a sharp black suit stepped inside, scanning the room with calculating eyes. His gaze landed on Daniel and sharpened. Daniel stiffened so subtly Evelyn almost missed it. His hand closed over the notebook, sliding it out of sight. The man's lips curled into a cold smile. He didn't approach, didn't need to. His message was clear: "I see you." Without a word, the suited man turned and left, the door swinging, shut behind him with a soft, ominous click. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. She turned to Daniel, but he was staring at the door, his jaw tight, his entire body coiled like a spring. "Friend of yours?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. Daniel forced a laugh, but it sounded wrong. "Something like that," he said. The lie was obvious. The storm brewing behind Daniel's eyes was obvious. And Evelyn knew. Whatever secrets Daniel Reed was hiding, they were about to catch up to both of them. Evelyn didn't press him. She wanted to. The questions burned on her tongue, but she knew better. Instead, she watched Daniel gather himself, piece by piece, like a man patching armor with trembling hands. His smile, when it came, was brittle and wrong. She hated seeing it. It made her chest ache in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. "You okay?" she asked softly, when the silence between them had stretched too long. Daniel nodded without meeting her eyes. "Yeah, just ghosts," he said, his voice thin. "They like to visit when you least expect them." He stood abruptly, shoving the notebook deep into his jacket. "I should go." Evelyn stood too, the words catching in her throat. "Don't go," she wanted to say. "Don't leave me wondering." But she didn't. She just tucked her hands into her pockets and nodded, like she understood. Maybe she did, more than she wanted to admit. "I'll see you around," Daniel said, offering a quick, strained smile. He slipped out the door. And this time, Evelyn didn't follow. Instead, she sat back down at the table, staring at the spot where the paper crane had rested just yesterday. She could still feel its ghost weight in her palm. The city outside the bookstore windows blurred into streaks of grey. Her chest felt hollow, as if something vital had been ripped out and carried into the street. Days passed without word from Daniel. Evelyn threw herself into the mechanical rhythm of survival. Job applications, missed calls from the landlord, cheap coffee, restless nights. She checked the bookstore window every time she passed, but the corner table remained empty, gathering dust. Part of her knew she was being foolish. She barely knew him. He owed her nothing. But that didn't stop the ache in her ribs, or the quiet, traitorous voice that whispered, "Maybe you mattered to him too." One evening, after another fruitless day of job hunting, Evelyn found herself wandering toward the Riverside Park. It was a place she used to go as a kid, when her world felt too heavy to carry. Tonight, the park was nearly empty, the winter air keeping most people indoors. She sat on a bench overlooking the dark water, pulling her jacket tighter against the chill. Her fingers found their way into her pocket, brushing against the edges of the old paper crane she kept there like a talisman. She pulled it out, smoothing the creases with care. "Even broken wings can fly," she murmured. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision. She tensed instinctively, but when she turned, she recognized the silhouette. Daniel, hunched shoulders, hands stuffed into his jacket, like he'd been walking for miles without direction. He saw her at the same moment, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel crossed the distance between them and sat down on the bench without asking, close, too close. "You found me," Evelyn said quietly. "Wasn't trying to," Daniel muttered. "Or maybe I was. I don't know anymore." They sat in silence, the cold seeping into their bones. Finally Daniel spoke, voice rough. "The man at the bookstore, he's not a friend. He's a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Evelyn asked, even though part of her didn't want to know. Daniel hesitated, raking a hand through his hair. "Of the life I walked away from," he said. "Of the promises I broke. Of everything I'm trying not to be." Evelyn turned to face him fully. "You don't have to tell me," she said, "but you don't have to lie to me either." Daniel looked at her then, really looked, and whatever he saw seemed to strip away the last of his defenses. His voice cracked when he spoke. "I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to be this." "This?" Evelyn echoed, confused. "Lost," he whispered. The word hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Evelyn reached into her jacket again, her fingers trembling. She pulled out another crane, smaller this time, folded from the corner of an old map. Without a word, she set it on the bench between them. Daniel stared at it, his throat working. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Keep giving pieces of yourself away like they'll never run out." Evelyn smiled, but it was a sad thing. "Because if I don't, what's the point?" Daniel picked up the crane, turning it over in his hands. "I don't deserve this," he said. "You don't have to," Evelyn said simply. The river whispered against the banks, the city lights flickering in the distance, and beside her, Daniel Reed, a man full of shadows and broken promises, let the weight of her kindness settle over him like a second skin. For the first time, he didn't flinch, but somewhere beyond the park, the life he had tried to leave behind was stirring, and it wasn't finished with him yet. The days that followed blurred together, stitched by a fragile thread of routine. Evelyn and Daniel met almost daily now, in places that felt like they belonged to no one. Forgotten benches, back corners of libraries, coffee shops too small to matter. They spoke in half-truths and silences, building something out of the only currency they had left, presence. Evelyn learned small things about him, that he hated olives, that he could quote entire passages of obscure novels, that sometimes he would look at the horizon like he was searching for a door back to a place he couldn't return to. She didn't press for more. She knew better than to chase ghosts. Daniel, for his part, absorbed every scrap of her story. She allowed him to see her dreams of owning a cafe, her fear of being invisible, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. He said little, but he remembered everything. Still, a wall remained between them, invisible, but solid. Evelyn could feel it every time Daniel flinched at the sound of a siren, every time his hand tightened around a crumpled paper crane in his pocket. He was a man stitched together by old wounds, and no matter how much she wanted to, Evelyn knew she couldn't heal him unless he wanted to be healed. One afternoon, they sat together in a narrow alley behind the bookstore, sharing a stale sandwich Daniel had somehow talked the cafe owner into giving him. Evelyn took a bite, chewing thoughtfully before asking, "Are you ever going to tell me the real reason you ran?" Daniel froze. the sandwich halfway to his mouth, his jaw clenched. For a long moment, Evelyn thought he might get up and walk away, but then he set the food down carefully, his hands trembling. "I wasn't just running from a bad life," he said finally, his voice a rasp. "I was running from the life everyone else thought I should want." Evelyn frowned, confused. "What does that mean?" Daniel leaned back against the graffiti-covered wall, staring up at the sliver of grey sky above them. "My family, they're not the kind of people you can say no to. They built something, a name, a legacy, and they expected me to carry it. No questions, no choices." He spoke with a bitterness that made Evelyn's chest tighten. "They called it loyalty," he continued, his voice dropping. "I call it a cage." Evelyn watched him carefully. "You left it all behind?" Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. You don't leave people like that. You just delay the inevitable." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. Evelyn thought of the suited man in the bookstore, the cold smile, the predatory gaze. She understood now. Daniel wasn't just hiding from a bad memory, he was hiding from an empire. "Are they dangerous?" she asked, voice low. Daniel looked at her then, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of fear he couldn't hide. "Not in the way you think. Power doesn't need fists to break you, it just needs patience." A shiver ran down Evelyn's spine. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cold air gnawing at her bones. "Maybe you should leave the city," she said. "Start fresh somewhere they can't find you." Daniel shook his head. "Running only works until you run out of road." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the battered leather notebook. Flipping it open, he showed her a sketch, a small building, a cozy cafe with wide windows and paper cranes hanging from the ceiling like stars. "I was drawing this the night I walked away," he said quietly. "I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I wanted something real." Evelyn stared at the drawing, her throat tightening. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's you," Daniel said, looking at her in a way that made her feel like the ground was slipping beneath her feet. "You're what's real." Before she could respond, a sharp sound shattered the moment. A car door slamming somewhere nearby, the metallic click of boots on pavement. Daniel stiffened instantly, every muscle coiling tight. "They're close," he whispered. Evelyn's heart raced. "What do we do?" Daniel grabbed her hand, his grip firm but trembling. "We run," he said. And this time, Evelyn didn't hesitate. She ran with him into the labyrinth of the city, her heart pounding, the paper crane still clutched tight in her pocket. A fragile promise that even broken wings could fly. The alleyways twisted like a labyrinth around them, narrow and endless. Evelyn's boots splashed through puddles as she ran, hand still clutched tightly in Daniel's. His grip was fierce, almost desperate, like letting go would mean being swallowed by the city itself. The world blurred past in a haze of graffiti-stained, brick and flickering streetlights. "Left!" Daniel barked, yanking her down another alley, just as headlights swept the previous street. Evelyn's lungs burned with the effort of keeping up. Her heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the roar of the distant traffic, the echo of their footfalls, even the fear gnawing at the edges of her mind. They ducked behind a dumpster, pressing their backs to the cold metal, breaths heaving in the frozen air. Evelyn dared a glance over Daniel's shoulder. A shadowy figure crossed the mouth of the alley, slow and deliberate. Whoever they weren't in a hurry. They knew how to hunt. Daniel's forehead pressed briefly to hers, grounding her. His voice was a ghost against her ear. "We have to split up. It'll be harder for them to track us both." "No," Evelyn whispered back, fiercer than she expected. "I'm not leaving you." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. There was something heartbreaking in his gaze. Gratitude, guilt, fear, all tangled together. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Maybe not," she said, "but I'm here anyway." A beat passed between them, suspended and fragile. Then Daniel nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Without another word, he grabbed her hand again and took off into the night, weaving through the skeletal remains of the city's forgotten corners. They reached an old service tunnel entrance, half buried in trash and grime. Daniel pried the rusted door open, just wide enough for them to slip inside. The darkness swallowed them immediately. Evelyn's hand found the rough fabric of Daniel's jacket and held on tightly. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and old oil. Their footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as they moved deeper. Daniel pulled out a tiny flashlight from his pocket, the beam barely strong enough to cut through the gloom. It illuminated just enough to keep them from smashing into the walls, and revealed the maze ahead. "Where does this go?" Evelyn whispered. "Old maintenance routes. Some lead to the subway, some lead nowhere." Daniel's voice was steady, but the tension in his shoulders gave him away. "If we're lucky, we'll find a way out before they find us. And if we're not?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. They moved carefully now, their earlier adrenaline drained into a cold, sharp focus. Every sound, a drip of water, a distant clatter, made Evelyn's heart jolt. She wasn't built for this. She was built for coffee counters and daydreams, not cat-and-mouse games in the dark. Yet here she was, because of him. Because somewhere deep inside, she had already decided she would rather be lost with Daniel than safe without him. After what felt like hours, they reached a junction. 3 tunnels branched out in different directions, each one as dark and unwelcoming as the others. Daniel hesitated, scanning the grimy walls for some forgotten map, some hint. Nothing. "We have to choose," he said, grim. Before Evelyn could respond, a faint noise drifted down the tunnel behind them. Footsteps, echoing, getting closer. Panic surged through her chest. She grabbed Daniel's sleeve. "Left," she said, not because she knew, but because standing still would kill them faster. Daniel didn't question her. He just moved. They plunged into the leftmost tunnel, the beam of the flashlight jittering wildly with their steps. The air grew colder, the walls narrower. Evelyn stumbled once, catching herself on Daniel's back. He steadied her without breaking stride. "Almost there," he muttered, but Evelyn could feel the walls closing in. The tunnels were narrowing, the air thickening, and behind them, the footsteps were gaining. Suddenly a door loomed ahead, metal, dented, but not locked. Daniel wrenched it open, pushing Evelyn through first. They burst into a small, abandoned maintenance room, the walls lined with rusted tools and old lockers. Daniel slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. Silence. Evelyn collapsed onto an overturned crate, her entire body trembling. Daniel leaned against the door, head bowed, chest heaving. For a long time, neither spoke. Only their ragged breathing filled the room. Finally, Daniel looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion and something deeper, fear. "I'm sorry," he said, voice breaking. "I didn't want to drag you into this." Evelyn stood slowly, crossing the room until she stood inches from him. She reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with trembling fingers. "You didn't drag me," she said. "I chose." Daniel closed his eyes, as if the words physically hurt him. Then, without thinking, without planning, he leaned in and pressed his forehead to hers. "I'm scared," he whispered. "So am I," Evelyn breathed, but neither of them moved away. Outside, the city kept breathing, relentless and indifferent. But inside that tiny room, hidden from the world, 2 broken people held onto each other. And for the first time, Evelyn realized that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about surviving anymore. Maybe it was about finding something worth surviving for. The silence between them thickened until it felt almost tangible. Evelyn could hear the blood pounding in her ears, feel the tremor in Daniel's breath against her skin. She had never been this close to anyone. Not really. Not like this, vulnerable, exposed, terrified. And still she didn't pull away. Daniel spoke first, his voice a low rasp, barely above a whisper. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning." Evelyn swallowed hard, her fingers curled slightly against his jacket, feeling the coarse fabric under her palms. "Then tell me now," she said. Daniel leaned back just enough to look at her, his eyes darker than she remembered. "My real name isn't Daniel Reed," he said, and the floor seemed to shift beneath Evelyn's feet. "It's Daniel Carrington." The name meant nothing to her at first, just another piece of a puzzle missing too many edges. But Daniel's face told her it should have meant something. The weight of it settled between them like a stone. "My family," Daniel continued, voice hollow, "owns Carrington Holdings." Evelyn blinked, stunned. She had heard the name. Everyone had. Carrington Holdings controlled everything from luxury hotels to private airports. Old money, untouchable money, a dynasty built on polished smiles and ruthless ambition. "You're—" she breathed, unable to finish the sentence. Daniel gave a hollow laugh. "Yeah, I'm supposed to be the crown prince, the heir to the empire. I was groomed for it from the moment I could walk." Evelyn staggered back a step, needing space to process. "But you left," she said, her voice thin. "I ran," Daniel corrected, shame flickering across his face. "The life they planned for me. It wasn't a life. It was a prison, meetings, arranged engagements. Decisions made in boardrooms while pretending they were family dinners." He scrubbed a hand through his hair, his frustration raw and bleeding through every word. "They didn't care what I wanted. They didn't care who I was. They just cared about the image." Evelyn's mind spun. She thought of the suited man in the bookstore, the way Daniel had flinched at every shadow. He wasn't just another lost soul trying to survive. He was a target, a liability, a rebel against a machine that didn't tolerate betrayal. "And now they want you back," she said, the realization cold and sharp in her gut. Daniel nodded. "Or silenced." The words stole the air from her lungs. She sat heavily back onto the crate, feeling like the ground had given way beneath her. "I should have stayed away," Daniel said. "I should have let you walk away the night we met, but I—" He broke off, closing his eyes tightly. "I was selfish." Evelyn stared at him, heart thudding painfully against her ribs. "You weren't selfish," she said finally, her voice cracking. "You were human." A silence fell between them, heavier now, saturated with everything they couldn't say. Outside, the city continued to move, indifferent, relentless. Inside the crumbling maintenance room, two people sat with their broken truths laid bare, no more lies left between them. "I'm scared," Daniel admitted again, softer this time. "So am I," Evelyn whispered, echoing him. For a long moment, they just sat there, not touching, not speaking, just breathing together, holding on to the thin thread that tethered them to each other and to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. When Daniel finally moved, it was slow, deliberate. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the first crane she had given him, the one with the words scrawled on its wing. "Even broken wings can fly," he read aloud, his voice shaking. Evelyn's throat tightened painfully. "You believed that," Daniel said, "even when I didn't." She blinked rapidly, willing the tears not to fall. "I still do," she whispered. He reached for her hand, hesitant, almost reverent. And when she didn't pull away, he twined their fingers together, grounding himself in her touch. "I don't know how to fight them," he said. "Not the way they fight." "You don't have to," Evelyn said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her. You just have to survive. We just have to survive. Daniel looked at her like she was a miracle he didn't deserve, and maybe he didn't. But he had her anyway. For tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow the world would come for them, but tonight they had each other. Morning came harsh and unforgiving. A pale, colorless light seeped through the cracks in the maintenance room door, casting everything in. A sickly gray. Evelyn woke to the sound of Daniel pacing, his boots scraping softly against the concrete floor. His hands were shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his shoulders tense with barely contained anxiety. She sat up slowly, every muscle stiff from the cold and the hard ground. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. Daniel shook his head without looking at her. "Couldn't." His voice was flat, brittle. "Too much noise in my head." Evelyn stood and crossed the room to him, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "We need a plan," she said. "We can't just hide here forever." Daniel turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her stomach twist. "They're going to find me, Evelyn. It's just a matter of time." "Then we don't make it easy for them," she said fiercely. "We stay moving. We stay ahead." He stared at her for a long moment, something like awe flickering across his face. "You don't even know what you're signing up for," he said quietly. "I know enough," she replied. "I know you. That's all that matters." For a moment something unspoken passed between them, a silent agreement forged in the fire of everything they'd already survived. Daniel nodded once, sharply, and that was enough. They slipped out of the maintenance room and into the waking city, keeping to the shadows, moving with a predator's caution. Every corner could hide a threat. Every face could belong to someone. Sent to drag Daniel back to the life he had fled, they found temporary refuge in an abandoned subway station, a relic from a different era, forgotten by most, but not yet erased by time. The platform was cracked and crumbling, the tracks rusted and useless, but it was dry, it was hidden, it was enough, for now. Daniel slumped onto a broken bench, burying his face in his hands. Evelyn sat beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "You can tell me to shut up if you want," she said after a while, "but maybe you should stop running." He lifted his head, frowning. "What are you talking about?" "I mean, stop running from yourself," she said, choosing her words carefully. "From who you really are. Maybe if you stop hiding, they'll have nothing left to use against you." Daniel let out a hollow laugh. "You don't understand. They don't need reasons. They create them." "Then create your own story," Evelyn insisted. "Take back the narrative." He stared at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something behind. The fear, something hard and bright and unbreakable. Resolve. Before either of them could say anything more, a sound echoed down the tunnels, the unmistakable click of boots on concrete. Daniel was on his feet in an instant, grabbing Evelyn's hand and pulling her behind one of the old support pillars. They held their breath, listening. Voices floated toward them, low and urgent. They were seen near here. "Fan out, check every tunnel." Evelyn squeezed Daniel's hand tighter. He squeezed back. They waited until the footsteps moved past them, fading into the distance. Only then did Daniel let out a slow, shaky breath. "We need to leave," he whispered. They moved through the maze of tunnels, their steps quick but silent. Evelyn could feel the pulse of the city above them. Cars, people, life moving on, blissfully unaware of the danger playing out beneath their feet. At one point, Daniel stumbled, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. Evelyn caught him, pulling his arm over her shoulders. "Just a little farther," she urged. He didn't argue. He just leaned into her, trusting her to hold him up. Finally, they emerged into a forgotten stairwell that led up to a side street. Daniel hesitated, scanning the empty road before stepping out into the pale morning light. The city greeted them with cold indifference. But Evelyn didn't care. She was just grateful to breathe fresh air again, even if danger still lurked, just out of sight. Daniel sagged against the brick wall, closing his eyes. "I can't keep doing this," he said, voice cracking. "I can't keep running forever." Evelyn stepped closer, her hand resting over his heart. "Then let's stop running," she said softly. "Let's fight." He opened his eyes, and in them she saw the man he could be, brave, stubborn, unstoppable. For a moment, Daniel just looked at her, as if memorizing every line of her face. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. And just like that, everything changed. The city didn't change just because they had. Life churned on around them. Taxis honking, coffee carts steaming, people hustling, oblivious to the war brewing in. The quiet spaces between breaths. But Daniel and Evelyn moved differently now, shoulders squared, steps deliberate. No more hiding, no more waiting for the storm to catch them. "We need to make noise," Daniel said as they slipped into a cramped internet cafe on the edge of Chinatown. The place smelled like burnt coffee and old plastic, and the computers looked like relics from a forgotten era. Perfect. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "I thought the whole point was to stay hidden." "Hidden doesn't mean silent," Daniel replied, his voice low but burning with new conviction. "If they think I'm running, they'll hunt me. If I make them chase smoke, maybe I can buy us time." Evelyn nodded slowly, the pieces clicking into place. "Create a distraction," she said. "Draw their eyes somewhere else." Daniel gave a grim smile. Exactly. They claimed a corner computer and worked quickly. Daniel typed furiously, his fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced ease. Evelyn leaned over his shoulder, watching the words appear on the screen. "To whom it may concern, I am not yours. I am not your future. I am not your legacy. Find someone else." There was no signature, just a photo attachment, a blurry image of Daniel standing at the edge of the city skyline, face shadowed, middle finger raised toward the gleaming towers behind him. "Subtle," Evelyn murmured. Daniel smirked. "Subtlety's overrated." With a click, he sent the message to half a dozen corporate gossip sites and a few anonymous email servers he somehow knew how to use. Within minutes, the first waves of response rippled through the digital sea. Evelyn could almost feel the Carrington Empire recoiling in fury. "We need to move," Daniel said, shutting down the computer. "They'll trace it fast." Evelyn grabbed his hand, adrenaline surging. "Where to?" "Somewhere they'd never expect me to be," he said. "Somewhere real." They ducked into the crowded streets, blending into the chaos. Daniel led her south, past crumbling warehouses and graffiti-laced walls, until they reached a district that looked almost abandoned. Evelyn's heart hammered as she realized where they were headed. An old artist commune, infamous for its bohemian residence and disdain for anything resembling authority. Inside the main building, the air smelled of paint, sweat, and burning incense. People lounged on mismatched couches, sketching, arguing, dreaming. No one paid them any mind. Daniel fit in here in a way that startled her, like a wolf slipping back into the wild after too long in a cage. A wiry man with dreadlocks and paint-splattered jeans approached, sizing them up. "Friends of Lucas?" he asked, voice wary. Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Friends of friends." That was enough. In places like this, names meant less than energy. If you carried yourself like you belonged, you did. They found a room on the second floor, an empty studio with cracked windows and a mattress shoved into a corner. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was a start. Daniel collapsed onto the mattress, arms splayed, staring up at the stained ceiling. Evelyn perched on the edge, watching him. "You've done this before," she said quietly, disappearing. Daniel nodded without looking at her. "Too many times." "But this time's different," Evelyn said. He turned his head, meeting her gaze. "Yeah, because this time, I'm not alone." The admission hit her harder than she expected. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Daniel closed his eyes at the touch, something easing in his face that made him look younger, almost boyish. "You know they'll hit back, right?" Evelyn said, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm counting on it," he replied, a glint of something dangerous and thrilling flashing in his eyes. The sun dipped lower outside, casting long golden shadows across the floor. For the first time since meeting Daniel, Evelyn felt not fear, but something fiercer burning in her chest. Hope, not the soft kind whispered into the darkness, the kind forged in fire. They were still outnumbered, still hunted, still fragile. But together they were no longer powerless, and that made them dangerous. The first blow came faster than either of them expected. The next morning, the headlines screamed across every tabloid and business site. Carrington, heir gone rogue. Insider claims fraud. Rebellion. Mental breakdown. Evelyn stared at the cracked phone screen, her hands trembling slightly. They didn't just want Daniel back. They wanted to destroy his credibility, his sanity, everything that made him human to the world. Paint him as unstable, broken, easier to erase that way. "They're scared," Daniel said, sitting on the mattress, eyes hollow but steady. "Scared people smear what they can't control." Evelyn sat beside him, the old springs creaking under her weight. "It's working," she said, voice thick with anger. "People believe it." Daniel shrugged like it didn't matter, but she could see the cracks in his armor, the way his hands fidgeted, the way he kept glancing at the boarded windows, as if expecting the world to crash through at any moment. "We expected this," he said, forcing the words out. "We knew they'd come hard." "But knowing doesn't make it easier," Evelyn whispered. He didn't reply. Instead, he stood and crossed the room, pacing in tight circles like a caged animal. Evelyn wanted to reach for him, to steady him, but she hesitated. She knew too well that sometimes touch could be a reminder of everything slipping away. A knock sounded at the door, 3 sharp raps. Daniel froze. Evelyn's heart leapt into her throat. They exchanged a look, silent and panicked. Daniel moved first, grabbing a broken chair and positioning it as a makeshift weapon. Evelyn pressed herself against the wall, eyes wide, breath shallow. "Who is it?" Daniel barked. A voice floated through the door, low, female, unfamiliar. "Relax, Romeo. I'm not here to turn you in." Daniel hesitated, his muscles taut. After a beat, he opened the door just wide enough to peer out. A woman stood there, arms crossed, a cigarette dangling from her lips. She wore ripped jeans, a leather jacket, and an expression that said she'd seen the end of the world and gotten bored by it. "Name's Riley," she said, blowing out smoke. "Lucas sent me." Daniel relaxed marginally and opened the door wider. Riley stepped in without waiting for an invitation, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "You're the ghost everyone's whispering about," she said, smirking. "You're causing quite the mess upstairs." Daniel said nothing. Evelyn stepped forward, wary. "Why are you here?" Riley snuffed out her cigarette on the heel of her boot. "Because you're about to be very popular. Carrington's offering a bounty big enough to make angels fall." Daniel's mouth tightened. "How much?" "Enough that half the city's gonna come sniffing for you," Riley said bluntly. "You stay here. You're dead." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. Daniel looked at her, his jaw tightening. "What do you suggest?" he asked Riley. She shrugged. "Move, change, adapt, blend." She tossed a crumpled paper onto the mattress, a map of the city marked with safe houses and underground routes. "Or don't, your funeral." With that, Riley turned and sauntered out, leaving the stench of cigarette smoke and warning hanging heavy in the air. Daniel stared at the map without moving. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" He lifted his eyes to hers, raw, exhausted, but burning. "We fight smarter." They spent the next hour memorizing routes, planning their next moves. Daniel outlined backup plans for their backup plans. Evelyn learned how to read shadows and hear footsteps where none should exist. They became creatures of survival, lean, sharp, and desperate. And through it all, Evelyn clung to the one thing she refused to let the Carrington Empire take from her: hope. Late that night, As they prepared to move again, Daniel paused by the broken window, looking out over the city lights. "Thank you," he said quietly. Evelyn stepped beside him. "For what?" "For not running when it got messy." She smiled, a sad, tired thing. "Messy's all I've ever known." Daniel turned to her, and in the dim light, Evelyn saw him. Not the heir, not the fugitive, but the man, bruised but unbroken, terrified but still standing. "I'm not losing you," he said fiercely. "Then don't," she whispered. And with that fragile promise hanging between them, they slipped back into the night, together, against the world. They moved like ghosts through the city's underbelly, slipping from one safe house to the next. Each stop brought them only hours of rest before they were forced to move again. Carrington's reach was longer than they had feared. News vans prowled the streets. Flyers with Daniel's face, blurred and unflattering, were taped to lampposts and subway walls. Evelyn watched Daniel deteriorate under the pressure, his shoulders hunched lower. His smiles, rare already, disappeared completely. At night, when he thought she was asleep, she heard him whispering apologies into the darkness, as if trying to bargain with a god that had long since stopped listening. She hated it. She hated how the world treated him like a criminal for wanting freedom, hated how powerless she felt to protect him, but most of all, she hated the growing whisper inside her, "What if we can't win this?" Their latest refuge was a condemned building near the river, its windows boarded up, its floors sagging, under the weight of too many forgotten years. As Evelyn patched the drafty holes with scrap cloth, Daniel paced restlessly, unable to settle. "We're running out of places," he said, voice tight. "We'll find more," Evelyn replied, forcing confidence she didn't feel. Daniel shook his head. "No! We're running out of time!" She crossed to him, grabbing his hand. "Then we make time." Daniel stared at her, and in his eyes she saw the war waging inside him. Hope versus surrender, love versus fear, future versus past. "I can't drag you down with me," he said hoarsely. "You're not dragging me anywhere," Evelyn shot back. "I chose this. I chose you." He squeezed his eyes shut, the pain raw across his face. "You don't understand, Evelyn. You don't know what they'll do if they catch us." "Then explain it to me," she demanded, her voice cracking, "because I'd rather know the truth than be left wondering." Daniel opened his mouth, then froze. There, beyond the broken window, a shape moved, a figure, watching. Daniel's body went rigid. Evelyn followed his gaze and saw the glint of something metallic catching the moonlight. "Gun." "No time," Daniel rasped. They moved in a blur, grabbing what little they had, a backpack, a map, each other. They raced down the sagging stairwell, their footsteps thunderous in the empty shell of the building. Shots rang out. Wood splintered around them as they ducked and ran, heartbeats thudding like war drums. Evelyn gripped Daniel's hand so tightly, her fingers ached. She didn't dare let go. Out into the freezing night air they burst, sprinting through the skeletal streets. No time to think, no time to plan, just move. The city blurred around them. Grey concrete, neon signs, the stink of exhaust and fear. Somewhere behind them, footsteps pounded in pursuit. Shouts tore through the night. Evelyn's lungs burned. Her legs screamed. Still she ran. Daniel pulled her down an alley, vaulted a chain-link fence, dragged her after him. They stumbled through a labyrinth of dumpsters and broken glass, ducking behind crumbling walls and rusted-out cars. At last, breathless and bleeding from a cut across his forehead, Daniel hauled them into a narrow service door behind a boarded-up market. He slammed the door shut, bracing it with a metal pipe. For a long moment they just stood there, gasping, leaning against each other like two survivors of a shipwreck. Finally, Evelyn spoke, voice ragged. "We can't keep doing this." Daniel nodded miserably. "I know." She pushed him back slightly, forcing him to look at her. Then we fight." He stared at her, lost. "How?" She took a shuddering breath. "We expose them." Daniel blinked. "What?" "Your family," she said. "The whole Carrington empire. Their lies, their crimes, whatever dirt they have, we find it. We drag it into the light." Daniel shook his head, panic rising. "Evelyn, you don't know what you're suggesting. They're monsters. They'll try to crush us," she interrupted fiercely. "But we're already broken. They can't break what refuses to die." A long silence stretched between them. Then slowly, Daniel smiled. Not the tired, broken thing she had seen for weeks, but something sharper, stronger, a smile full of teeth. "All right," he said, voice low and dangerous. "Let's burn them down." And somewhere deep inside her battered, bleeding heart, Evelyn knew. They had just declared war. The plan formed between them like lightning, quick, reckless, born from desperation. Evelyn knew it was crazy, suicidal even, but survival had stripped them of the luxury of fear. All they had left was each other, and the truth they refused to let die in the shadows. Daniel led her to a contact he barely trusted, an old journalist named Marcus Vane, a man exiled from the mainstream press for digging too deep into corporate scandals. They found him nursing a whiskey at a dive bar that smelled like lost dreams. Marcus listened without interrupting as Daniel laid everything bare, names, dates, dirty dealings buried under layers of Carrington gloss. His hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, smoke curling around his weary face. "You're insane," Marcus said when Daniel finished. "You know that, right?" Daniel's mouth twisted into a grim smile. "Insanity's relative." Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You're not just poking the bear, kid. You're setting its fur on fire." "Good," Evelyn said coldly. For a beat, Marcus just stared at them. Two broken kids declaring war against an empire. Then he laughed, a sharp bark-like sound, and stubbed out his cigarette. "All right, I'm in." They spent the night digging deeper, hacking through old files, connecting dots the Carrington family had buried years ago. Evelyn's head swam with numbers, names, scandals that would topple lesser dynasties, illegal acquisitions, bribes, silent settlements, and, buried deepest, threats and coercion to eliminate anyone who dared to step out of line. Daniel's hands shook as he uncovered a folder labeled simply D. Carrington, Containment Strategy. Inside were emails, contracts, psychological evaluations, plans to institutionalize him if he refused to comply with the family's wishes. Strip him of autonomy, discredit him permanently. Evelyn watched his face pale as he scrolled through the evidence of how little his life had ever really belonged to him. "I was never their son," he whispered, voice hollow, "just a product." Evelyn touched his arm gently. "You're more than what they tried to make you." Daniel closed the laptop with a finality that felt like the slamming of a coffin lid. "We take this public," he said, his voice iron. Marcus nodded, already pulling out a battered recorder. "We do this now, before they find us." They recorded everything, Daniel's testimony, the files, the timeline. Evelyn sat beside him, holding his hand under the table, grounding him every time his voice faltered. When they finished, Marcus promised to have the exposé live by dawn. "There's no turning back after this," Marcus warned. "We never intended to," Daniel said. They left the bar before first light, stepping into a world that still spun obliviously. Around them, Evelyn felt the weight of the coming storm settle over her shoulders, but she welcomed it. They were finally taking control. They headed back to the crumbling artist commune where it had all begun. As they crossed the threshold of the familiar building, a strange peace fell over Evelyn. No matter what happened next, they had chosen, and their path. In the half-light of early morning, Daniel turned to her, his face a canvas of exhaustion and defiant hope. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" she asked, voice catching. For seeing me, he said, when everyone else only saw what they wanted me to be. Tears burned behind Evelyn's eyes. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the very first paper crane she had ever made, the one she had always kept for herself, too afraid to give away. She placed it carefully in Daniel's hand. He opened the tiny wings, reading the faded words written inside. You are enough. Daniel's breath hitched. His hand closed around the crane like it was something sacred. You always were, Evelyn whispered. For a long moment they stood in the stillness, wrapped in a fragile, indestructible kind of love. Then Daniel leaned in and kissed her. Not a desperate kiss, but one full of promises, full of everything they had fought to claim as their own. The city beyond the windows shimmered with the first light of day. Somewhere in the chaos, the first sparks of revolution were catching fire. Tomorrow, the world would burn, but tonight they stood together, unbreakable. The city woke slowly, oblivious to the match already lit beneath its foundations. Evelyn sat beside Daniel in the dim light of the commune, their hands twined together. As the first pings hit Marcus's encrypted phone, alerts, messages, headlines, it had begun. Breaking. Carrington Empire under investigation following whistleblower leak. Daniel stared at the screen, unmoving. Evelyn could feel the tremor running through his body, fear, relief, terror, hope. A symphony of emotions crashing against each other inside him. They know, he said, voice barely a whisper. They can't undo the truth, Evelyn said firmly. It's too late. Outside, sirens wailed. Not for them, not yet, but the city's. Heartbeat had quickened. Journalists swarmed Carrington properties. Protesters gathered, waving signs and chanting slogans. It was chaos. It was beautiful. Daniel's phone buzzed violently. Unknown number. He answered without thinking, holding the device to his ear with a shaking hand. Evelyn watched him, her heart in her throat. For a long moment there was only silence. Then a voice, low, venomous, slithered through the speaker. You think you've won, boy? You're nothing. A blip. A mistake. Daniel's face went slack. With fury and fear. You will regret this, the voice hissed. You will watch everything you love turn to ash. The line went dead. Daniel dropped the phone like it had burned him. His chest heaved. Evelyn moved instantly, wrapping her arms around him, holding him together with sheer force of will. They can threaten all they want, she whispered into his ear. It's over. Daniel pressed his forehead against hers, drawing strength from her touch. I'm scared, he confessed again, voice breaking. So am I, she admitted, tears blurring her vision. But that doesn't mean we stop. Around noon, Marcus arrived at the commune, grinning like a madman. You two just made history, he crowed, waving a stack of printed articles. Every major network is running the story. Authorities are opening formal investigations. Public sentiment's turning. Evelyn let out a shaky laugh, half disbelieving. Daniel just sagged into the couch, overwhelmed. They'll still come after us, he said. Probably, Marcus agreed, but it won't be as easy now. Too many eyes watching. For the first time, Evelyn saw a crack in the invincibility of the Carrington name. Real, tangible cracks. No matter what happened next, the Empire had been wounded deeply. Daniel stood, his movements slow but deliberate. He crossed to a broken window and looked out over the city. Evelyn followed, standing beside him. We'll have to disappear for a while, he said. I know, she said. You don't have to come with me. She turned, cupping his face in her hands. Daniel, she said firmly, I was never following you. I'm choosing you, every step. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed. When he opened them, something had shifted. A new strength, raw and unshakable. Together they packed what little they had no goodbyes, no promises of when or how they would return. Just a quiet, fierce determination to keep living on their terms. As they left the commune, Evelyn slipped her hand into Daniel's and squeezed. One last time, she unfolded the paper crane, the very first message she had ever dared to believe. In even broken wings can fly. Daniel smiled, a real unguarded smile, and tucked the crane into his jacket. The city stretched out before them, vast, dangerous, unforgiving. But they weren't running anymore, they were flying. Together. Wow, what a story, right? I'd love to hear what you thought. Drop a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tell me where you're watching from. And hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories we have on the channel. There's so much more waiting for you.